The premeditated murder of Joe Cinque. This is a love story of a couple who seem to be complete opposites, whose cultural backgrounds were the paradox of being completely different, yet very much the same. Giuseppe Joe Cinque, who came from a traditional Catholic Italian family, and Anu Singh, who came from a traditional Indian family. They'd meet in a bar in Newcastle, New South Wales, while Anu was home on a break from university. By all accounts, they were both head over heels for each other. So much so, that Joe would leave his home in Newcastle to move to a duplex in the suburb of Downer, some 5 hours away. It would be the place that Joe Cinque would take his last laboured breaths, for this is where Joe would die of an overdose, a mix of Rohypnol and heroin. Before one comes to the conclusion of just a tragic accident, understand that Joe was not a drug addict. Joe didn't even know the drugs had been administered to him. This was a premeditated murder. Joe was not only betrayed by the physical killer, Anu Singh, but by the people who knew about the plan to murder him leading up to his death. This is a love story, a story about Anu's love for herself, her love of manipulation, attention-seeking, possessiveness, and excuses. This is also a story about the complete ineptitude of the Australian legal system, where those just as responsible as Anu were free to walk, and Anu herself only suffered a minor hiccup in her life. This episode is dedicated to Joe Cinque, his parents Maria and Nino, and his younger brother Anthony. I am truly sorry for your loss. The main source material for this episode is Helen Garner's book, titled Joe Cinque's Consolation, as well as news articles and interviews. I highly suggest everyone gets himself a copy of Joe Cinque's Consolation, but be warned, it is emotionally exhausting. I have read a countless amount of books in my life, though this book completely drained me. I had to put it down numerous times throughout the course of reading it, simply because I was so angry, upset, shocked, and completely let down, both regarding the treatment of Joe and the lack of accountability of so many people who could have stopped it. In an act of full transparency, I'd like to make it completely clear that this book is biased in favour of Joe Cinque. Anu Singh and her family were asked to contribute, at which point I believe it would have given the book a little more balance. But Anu first showed signs in contributing towards the book, but ultimately backed out. Anu's father, Dr. Paddy Singh, acted as an intermediary between the author and Anu, but his only interest seemed to be a story which would paint Anu in a positive light, to project an image that she was just a lost soul who was a slave to her mental illness, basically relieving her of responsibility for her crime. He also seemed interested in taking part if there was to be monetary gain from the story. There was also a movie adaptation based on the book, court proceedings, and police evidence. The director of the film, which goes by the same name as the book, Joe Cinque's Consolation, was asked why he didn't seek input for the movie from Anu Singh. He said, quote, "Anu is on the record many times in terms of how she sees the events. She chose not to be part of the trial to give evidence. She chose not to be part of the writing of the book. And then she wouldn't agree to our freedom of information requests to access certain bits of evidence, so she resisted that independent research too." Unquote. Now without further ado, this is the case of the premeditated murder of Joe Cinque. Giuseppe Joe Cinque was born and raised in Newcastle, New South Wales. Newcastle, New South Wales is 160 kilometres north of Sydney. He started his school life at St Mary's in Gateshead, New South Wales, and finished high school only a few kilometres away at St Francis Xavier's College in Hamilton East. He was well liked. His friends would describe him as a kind, outgoing boy who was a stereotypical wog. He was interested in cars, soccer, and he liked to eat. Those close to him would claim that he was a late bloomer who didn't have a lot of luck with the females. They would state that while he hadn't yet grown into his looks, that wasn't his problem. His poor luck with girls stemmed from his shyness and use of boyish humour when talking to them. His idea of seduction usually included telling a girl a fart joke or the like. Though his romantic failings weren't to overshadow the impact Joe had on people of both genders. The males remember him as someone who never held a grudge. This was shown when Joe and a group of his friends drove past the pool. The group got the idea they'd go for a late night dip. On hearing this, Joe jumped out of the car, stripped off, and jumped into the pool before anyone knew what was happening. His friends, being typical teenagers, decided this would be a perfect time for a practical joke. They bundled up his clothes and drove off. They circled the block to find Joe hiding. He was naked behind a bush. They pulled over, opened the door, and as soon as Joe got close, they'd drive off. This is something they repeated numerous times before finally letting him back in the car, at which point Joe wasn't angry, but instead laughing along with the joke. His friends also point out another incident that seemed to catch the essence of Joe. After a school party, a bunch of schoolgirls proceeded to pile into a car that they had hired for the occasion. As they were getting in, a drunk adult male tried to jump in with them. Joe stopped him, numerous times in fact, from getting in with the teenage girls. When the man became confrontational, Joe diffused the situation, leading the man off saying, "Let's talk about it." He didn't fuel the fire or become confrontational himself. Something those close to him said was his way being, "Let's not get mad, let's talk about it." After graduating high school, Joe would later attend university, obtaining a degree in civil engineering. Soon after leaving university, he would gain a position that allowed him to use that degree to its full potential. The firm he worked for was located in his hometown of Newcastle, New South Wales. He was known as a punctual, hard-working employee, though on commencement of his relationship with the new Singh, his work would suffer. She would constantly need him, both during and after work hours. In regards to his work ethic, his mother Maria would say that he was always busy. He'd never sit still and was always multitasking, who was completing 2 or 3 projects at one time. Anu Singh was born in India on the 3rd of September 1972 to her parents Pradyam Paddy Singh and Surinder Singh, both of which were medical doctors. The year following Anu's birth, Anu and her 2 parents would move from India to Newcastle, Australia. The Singhs would have another child, giving Anu a brother named Tony. Anu's early schooling is unclear, but she would later attend the same Catholic high school as Joe, at St. Francis Xavier's College in Hamilton East, New South Wales. She was 1 year below Joe. She would graduate from that school in 1990. A year later, in 1991, she would move to Canberra to undertake an economics and law degree at the Australian National University. Anu would claim that it was in year 10 she began to experiment with cannabis and alcohol. They would graduate to more serious drugs, such as acid, cocaine, speed, crystal meth and ecstasy, not to mention heroin, which will play a major part in the story later on. Regarding her early life, her father claims that during her early years, she was always a happy and well-adjusted child, though cracks began to form as she aged. As she grew older, she also grew more disobedient and headstrong, wearing revealing clothing and not helping out around the house. Her father gives an example of this when she would sneak out during the night to meet boys without her parents' permission. He also goes on to state that major mental health issues started to surface during her early and mid-20s, which were exacerbated by dangerous diets and exhausting workout routines. In 1995, Joe and Anu would meet during a night out in Newcastle. Joe's friends would try to warn him early on, telling him she was not the type of girl that would be a good match for him. for Anu had a reputation. One friend would state, "Have fun, Joe, but don't get attached." At the time of meeting and starting a relationship with Joe, Anu was already in a relationship with a man named Simon Walsh, which had started in late 1993. From Anu's own words, the relationship was an intense one, where she claimed that if her and Simon had been any closer, it would have been viewed as incestuous. During her relationship with Simon Walsh, Anu had become pregnant and undergone a pregnancy termination. Now, I don't mention that to stigmatize the practice nor the recipient. It just ties into the range of emotions both Simon and Anu had experienced during their relationship. It also ties into a motive one of her closest friends would later give for Joe's murder. Since Anu was already in a relationship at the time of meeting and commencing a relationship with Joe, her relationship with Simon came to a halt, as Simon had found out about it and broke it off with Anu. It is unclear whether Joe was aware of Anu's relationship at the time, but by all accounts, Joe was head over heels in regards to Anu and their new relationship. So much so, they had continued their relationship long distance, Joe in Newcastle and Anu in Canberra. Because of the distance between them, their main contact was via phone. The Cinques would later state that Joe and Anu called each other so much that the Cinques' phone bill would be up to $800, something Joe assured them he'd pay. It was during this time that Anu's eating disorder started to appear and wreak havoc on Joe's life. Anu would constantly call Joe stating she needed him because of her medical afflictions. There were times he would leave work in the middle of the day and fly or drive to be with her, some 5 hours away. According to the Cinques, this was a trend that not only got worse with time, but there was a point where Joe's father Nino stepped in and told him that travelling all the way there was foolish. It wasn't because Nino was cold-hearted, he actually made a good point. He wanted to know why Anu's parents, both of which were and still remain medical doctors, weren't looking after her if her situation was as dire as she claimed. Nino was perplexed to what Joe could do for her. After all, it was her own parents, not Joe, who were doctors. After the talk, Joe decided not to run to her on that occasion. Joe's mother Maria also weighed in on the situation. After seeing the effect her beckoning was having on Joe's life, she told Joe that he was being manipulated. Maria wanted Joe to be his own person, and not to be controlled by Anu. She also stated that if Anu had visited as many doctors as she had claimed to, and those doctors could find nothing wrong with her, Joe couldn't do much else, and her actual motive was simply to get Joe to run to her. The secrecy surrounding their relationship on Anu's side was also taking a toll on Joe. Anu's family wasn't aware of Joe early on, to the point that Joe had to instruct his family to lie if one of the Singhs called asking who Joe was. Joe asked that if the Singhs were to call the Cinques, they were to claim Joe was a friend of Anu's brother Tony. This of course did not sit well with the Cinques. It was during this time that people who were close to Joe started to see a change in him. Those that had known Joe for a long time, but were new to meeting Anu, would claim that Anu dimmed Joe's personality. The godson of Joe's parents and longtime family friend of the Cinques, named Robert Taroni, shared a dinner with Joe and Anu early on in their relationship. Robert claimed that Anu completely dominated the night. She would take center stage, and Joe faded into the background, something that did not fit Joe's personality. Robert would also state that his initial impression of Anu was that she was a, quote, strange girl, unquote, whose discussion topics would seem just as weird when one considered the setting, especially when it was the first time meeting someone so close to Joe and his family. She started off by talking about death and the afterlife, asking those in attendance what their take on it was. She then went on to detail her previous relationship in great detail, where she would claim that if her and her ex-partner Simon were any closer, their relationship could have been seen as incestuous. Robert noticed this made Joe uneasy and uncomfortable, though Joe did not speak up and instead sat quietly. Robert also thought this line of discussion was disrespectful to Joe. and that Joe had to completely change the person he was, or else he would have not survived with Anu. Under relentless pressure from Anu, Joe would leave his job, his family, and friends and relocate 5 hours south to Canberra. There he would move in with Anu into the duplex on Anthill Street in the suburb of Downer. By 1997, Anu's constant mental ailments were starting to strain both Joe and their relationship. Her eating disorder had now peaked, and she'd compiled a list of imagined physical diseases. She believed she had everything from a muscle-wasting disease to AIDS, none of which had any substance outside of Anu's mind, and the dozens of doctors she would consult with at the time agreed. Physically, there was nothing wrong with Anu Singh. Depending on which quote-unquote expert you believe, she had everything from a personality disorder, extreme depression, or a mixture of ailments. It was also around this time that Anu would start to blame Joe for her health problems. Anu claims there was a point in their relationship that Joe had advised Anu to consume ipecac, as which he had heard models use to lose weight. Though Robert Taroni disagrees with this claim and states that he highly doubts Joe even knew of its existence. Syrup of ipecac is most often taken orally, though some treatments can be given intravenously. It is widely believed only to be used to induce vomiting, but in small doses can actually help with a range of ailments, including an expectorant, to thin mucus, or to improve appetite, though anything other than a very small amount will have only one outcome: vomiting, as the chemicals contained within ipecac are stomach irritants. This, of course, is the way Anu Singh was using the medication, a way to irritate her stomach, to vomit, to lose weight. Anu would blame Joe for her misuse of the drug, and would even go as far as using it as one of her many differing motives for killing Joe. Due to her perceived illnesses and her perceived view that Joe had a hand in them, she decided to formulate a suicide pact, a pact only Anu was aware of, and that she herself didn't go through with. On Sunday the 26th of October 1997, Joe's mother Maria became worried when Joe didn't make his usual Sunday call to her. Not hearing from her son all day, she decided at about 5 p.m. to call Joe instead. That was when a strange voice answered the phone. Maria inquired to who this person was. The person on the other end of the phone identified themselves by name and as being part of the ACT police. At this exact moment, there was a knock on the Cinque's door in Charlestown, New South Wales. Both Nino and Maria answered the door to see police standing there. They let the police in, at which point they asked Nino and Maria to sit down. It was then they said something had happened to Joe. Maria began screaming. She killed him, didn't she? Maria then called the Taroni household and said something had happened to Joe. She asked if Robert could meet her in the morning. The next morning, Robert stood next to Maria as she identified the body of her son, Giuseppe Joe Cinque. On seeing her son laying on a steel mortuary table, Maria collapsed. After viewing and identifying Joe, Maria and her godson Robert were taken to headquarters of the Australian Federal Police. Robert claims that the Federal Police told them early on that based on the evidence, they didn't believe Joe had committed suicide and there were signs of foul play, the perpetrator being Anu Singh. While the full details weren't known at that point in time, it became clear after the trial that Anu had spent months planning his death. A death that a group of people knew about beforehand, but did nothing to stop. Some of those in the group not only knew about Joe's impending doom, they actually helped acquire the drugs that killed him. Others showed Anu how to administer them. All of the people involved in the preparation of Joe's death were aware that Anu was threatening suicide and wanted to take her unsuspecting boyfriend with her. One of those friends was Madhavi Rao. Madhavi Rao, like Anu Singh, was a law student at the Australian National University. By all accounts, she was a shy and quiet individual who became Anu Singh's closest friend. Madhavi, much like Joe, would be bedazzled by the outspoken Anu Singh. So much so that over the course of their friendship, her role moved from friend to almost servant. As is Anu's nature, everyone close to Anu was supposed to be the supporting act, Anu herself the star. She expected nothing short of people's full, undivided attention, and that is exactly what she got from Madhavi Rao. If Madhavi Rao was not by her side, Anu would incessantly call in an attempt to find out why. The phone calls to Madhavi had become so high in frequency at all hours of the day and night that the housemates she shared her residence with made her take the phone to bed with her overnight. They were sick of being woken up by calls. Madhavi was at Anu's beck and call 24 hours a day. It was not unusual for Anu to call Madhavi in the middle of the night and demand she brought her food and other items, something which Madhavi was more than happy to fulfill. She would leave her house, go to the local market, and then hand-deliver the goods to Anu. Even though Madhavi was more than happy to be used as a slave by her friend, she was not without her own thoughts. She would speak at length behind Anu's back. Usually to her work colleagues, she would speak at length about how the worst thing in the criminal act was about to take place, and how she knew of the intimate details, and how she'd get away with being part of it. Anu and Madhavi would research how to kill people, as well as methods of suicide. The two law students would also scour books at the library regarding legal precedents of similar cases. Anu also read medical texts regarding mental illness, their symptoms, and telltale signs when being diagnosed. This undertaking wasn't to understand the anguish she claimed to be feeling at the hands of her own self-diagnosed and over-exaggerated ailments. This was purely to understand the process involved in both diagnosing severe mental illness and their use in the legal setting. She took great pride in telling people that she had studied these medical texts, boasting that the information she had gleaned from within them would allow her to claim limited culpability in a murder due to severe mental illness. Anu first decided on death/suicide via firearm as a method of killing her boyfriend, then apparently herself, though she had grossly overestimated both herself and her own contacts. The people she knew weren't hardened criminals with access to guns. Instead, they were lowly junkies whose only experience with the criminal underworld were being dependent on the drugs that those hardened criminals supplied to them. In light of this, and on advice of one of the junkies in question, Anu decided that a massive quantity of drugs, delivered both orally and intravenously, was a much easier and a much more poetic death for her unsuspecting boyfriend Joe. Almost a week before Joe Cinque's death, on Monday the 20th of October 1997, Anu Singh held a dinner party at the Anthill Street duplex that her and Joe shared. It was a last-minute affair, so much so that just before its commencement, Anu sent Madhavi Rao out to gather guests from nearby student residences. Those that were gathered were aware that either a suicide or a murder would take place preceding the dinner. They had all heard the brags and threats from either Anu or her cohort previously. One of these guests was an acquaintance of Madhavi's by the name of Olivia Pepitone. It would later be revealed she was aware of the plan of Anu to kill herself. It also came out later that several of the guests at this dinner party were told of Anu's plans as she drove them home after it had ended. The guests decided not to get involved. Joe, of course, was unaware that anything was amiss, and this was anything other than a run-of-the-mill dinner. It would come out during the trial that Anu had indeed tried to kill Joe following this dinner. According to a statement made by Madhavi, Anu had spiked Joe's coffee with Rohypnol tablets and attempted to inject him with heroin, but the syringe, which was pre-filled with heroin, had become unusable after its contents had congealed. While the guests at this first dinner party would later claim they didn't take the threats of suicide or murder seriously, one of them believed it enough to turn up on Madhavi's doorstep the following day, wanting to know if anyone had died. That person was Olivia Pepitone. The person who would obtain the heroin for Anu, and to a degree Madhavi, was a junkie known only as Mr. T. His real name is not available to the public because he was granted immunity for giving evidence. Though he was apparently a student at the same high school, St. Francis Xavier in Hamilton East, He was a year behind her. Anu first asked Mr. T to get a gun, but later settled on the use of drugs as a method of death. In August 1997, 2 months before Joe's death, Mr. T would procure $250 worth of heroin for Anu and Madhavi. He then got to the task of showing them how to prepare a fix before plunging an amount into his own vein. Using the same syringe, he then shot up Anu and Madhavi, Madhavi remarking, quote-unquote, "That's nice." It is believed that the remainder of the heroin from this deal is the same heroin which had congealed and clogged the syringe Anu would later use to try to kill Joe on the 20th of October. A month later, sometime in September, Anu and Madhavi would visit the home of another ANU student for a refresher course on cooking, drawing up, and injecting heroin. In the home of Jonathan Bowers Taylor, and in the company of his girlfriend Jasmine Kent, who happened to be an ex of Mr. T and a heroin addict herself, Anu and Madhavi were once again shown the finer points of using a syringe. They had brought Danish pastries for Jasmine, while Jonathan, Anu and Madhavi got down to business. Jasmine would later claim that she paid little attention to what was happening, as she was preoccupied with watching TV while eating the pastries. It was around this time that Madhavi would claim Anu was using her as a test subject. She would allow Anu to inject her to refine her skill of finding a vein, drawing up blood, and loading the contents of the syringe into a vein. In early October, Anu and Madhavi would once again arrive at the home of Mr. T. They wanted more heroin, this time a full gram, $500 worth. He went and scored the drugs, shot a small amount up into his own arm, and then, at Anu's request, filled 2 syringes with the remainder. When he asked what she planned to do with so much, she claimed that, quote, someone was coming with her, unquote. In other words, someone would be committing suicide with her. Anu would visit Mr. T once more, on the day of Joe's death, but more on that later. On Friday, the 24th of October 1997, another dinner party at Joe's and Anu's Antill Street duplex took place. Anu had called her friend Leonard Mancini and invited him. Madhavi invited a girl known only as Tanya Z in the source book, for her name would be suppressed and not released to the public. Tanya Z had known Madhavi for a while in passing. She met Anu for the first time in July 2017, when Anu and Madhavi had asked Tanya to borrow money to photocopy an article. Tanya later saw this article was about suicide. Madhavi had invited Tanya Z, and both Madhavi and Anu had gone to pick her up. On their way back to Joe and Anu's house, they stopped so Anu could run into a shop to buy something. It was at this time Madhavi turned to Tanya and said, quote, "I've got a big story, bigger than you've ever heard before. It's a secret. I'll tell you about it later," unquote. They then dropped Anu off before continuing on to pick up another guest. It was then Madhavi told Tanya Z that the dinner party was a send-off for Anu, as she planned to commit suicide afterwards. Tanya Z let her thoughts be known, saying it was morally wrong to be involved in such a thing. It was at this point that Madhavi said that Tanya should probably stay at her house that night instead of travelling all the way back to her own house. Tanya obliged. There would be at least 8 or 9 people in attendance at this dinner party: Joe, Anu, Madhavi, Leonard Mancini, and Tanya Z, as well as 5 or so other unnamed guests. The party seemed normal enough. Everyone was talking, eating, drinking, and nothing seemed amiss. Anu's friend Leonard Mancini would even tell Anu she seemed, quote, bubbly. She replied that was because she had consumed some Rohypnol. Leonard Mancini left soon after. Tanya Z left with him. Leonard dropped Tanya off at Madhavi's house, and he continued on home. He retired to bed by 12:30 a.m. Later that night, when Madhavi returned to her residence, Tanya noticed she was upset and annoyed. When pressed why, Madhavi said, quote, "It didn't work." Madhavi then went on to say that Joe was the problem, and that Anu wanted to take Joe with her when she committed suicide. She wanted to take Joe with her because she blamed him for her condition, her misuse of the syrup of Ipecac, as well as her failing relationship with her ex-partner. She also claims that Joe would roll around in his sleep saying, "You're such a slut, Anu." Medhavi then went on to tell Tanya that this was actually the second such dinner that had taken place, that the first one didn't go to plan because the Rohypnol that was in his system didn't stop him moving and the syringe was clogged. When Tanya asked Medhavi if Joe had taken the Rohypnol willingly, Medhavi's response made it clear that he hadn't. Tanya then asked if this business was all over with, that if Joe would now be left alone and no other attempts would be made on Joe's life. Medhavi assured her that she was done with it, and that Anu had made it clear to her that she no longer wanted her help. Medhavi claims that Anu said it was something she needed to do on her own. After Medhavi and Tanya were finished talking, it was 7:30 a.m. Tanya needed to be at work at noon, so Medhavi dropped her to the bus stop for her to get home. But Medhavi's word wasn't enough to stop Tanya's suspicions. As soon as Tanya got home, she called Medhavi and told her that she wasn't satisfied. She either wanted Leonard Mancini's number, who she believed would know what to do, or she would be contacting the police. Medhavi protested, claiming it was none of her business and that Joe would be fine, but Tanya wouldn't give up. Suddenly Anu appeared on the phone. She too protested that Tanya didn't know anything and that she possessed no evidence of the claim she was making. Tanya once again told them that they either give her Leonard Mancini's phone number or she'd be contacting the police. The pair knew they had no other option but to give her the phone number, which they did. But within the hour the pair were at Leonard Mancini's house, waiting for the phone call. Leonard Mancini's house had an extension which allowed Anu, Leonard and Tanya to be on a three-way call at the exact same time. Tanya began to tell the story of what Medhavi had told her, that Anu had tried to kill herself as well as Joe. Leonard Mancini's responses surprised her, for he didn't seem really interested, or to be taking Tanya's worries seriously. Anu then butted in, claiming she wasn't going to do anything, and it was just a big misunderstanding, etc. After Tanya was satisfied that she had said what she needed to say, and that she had let someone close to Anu know what was happening, she claimed she still wasn't satisfied. Anu responded that Leonard loved Joe and wouldn't let anything happen to him. She also offered a compromise. Anu said she would call her the following morning, and Tanya can tell her what she decided. They hung up. But later that morning, Tanya phoned Anu again, saying she was going to leave it alone, but warned Anu that if anything happened to Joe, her friends were now implicated. Later that night, Medhavi would turn up to Tanya Z's door, thanking her for leaving it alone. Tanya ushered her out, telling her she wanted no more to do with Medhavi or Anu Singh. She said she thought it would be best they no longer communicate. Tanya Z would be the only person in the whole story who took even cursory measures to try and save Joe. But it was already too late. Anu had already begun putting her plan in motion the night before, once a dinner party had wrapped up. Sometime during the late night of Friday the 24th, or the early morning of Saturday the 25th, Anu Singh had once again spiked Joe with Rohypnol. So much, in fact, he didn't wake from his unwilling drug stupor until Saturday evening. At which point, he must have known he'd been drugged, because he began searching the house for pills, throwing out any that he could find. Anu had made plans for Medhavi to visit so they could study. On her arrival, Anu accused Medhavi of being the one who administered Joe with the drugs without Joe's or Anu's knowledge. Medhavi left it being accused and spent the night with other friends. Anu then spiked Joe's coffee again, this time with the biggest dose yet. The actual dosage isn't known, but it was enough to finally put Joe into enough of a stupor that would allow Anu to slide the needle into his arm and dump the contents of the heroin-filled syringe into his vein, enough to completely incapacitate Joe and render him deeply unconscious, but not enough to kill him. At around 8 a.m. on Sunday morning, Anu dragged Medhavi back to the Antill Street duplex and into Joe's bedroom. By this time, Joe was slightly blue, but still breathing shallowly. Anu instructed Madhavi to drive her to an ATM. There, Madhavi withdrew $250, handed it to Anu, and then got out of the car at a set of lights and walked home after a brief fight with Anu. Anu then continued on to Mr. T's house. By this time, it was approximately 9:30 AM. She asked for another $250 worth of heroin. He went and scored it, took his cut of the drugs, then cooked and drew up the remainder in a syringe. She then went back to the Anthill Street address. From that point on, there is no official record of what happened. Anu Singh solicitors claim there is no evidence that she also dumped the contents of this syringe into Joe's body. The same body that had 2 distinct track marks in his arm. The court papers also clearly state that the Crown prosecution were working on the same theory, that Joe had been injected 2 separate times. Just before midday, Anu called Bronwyn Kamak. An hour and a half later, Joe would be pronounced dead. Bronwyn Kamak was a heroin user who provided Anu Singh with the Rohypnol she had used to drug Joe on at least 3 occasions by this point. Anu and Bronwyn had come to an agreement. Bronwyn would make a doctor's appointment to get a script for the Rohypnol in exchange for some heroin. On Wednesday the 22nd of October 1997, and only 3 days before Joe's death, Anu picked Bronwyn up from home and drove her to the doctors in the suburbs of Farah. En route to the doctors, Anu opened a box containing 2 syringes. Bronwyn injected a quantity from one syringe as they sat in the car. The needle, which still contained heroin, was placed back in the box. She came out of the doctor's appointment with a script for 15 Rohypnol. She gave Anu the script and a concession card which would allow her to get the pills at a discounted rate. She said Anu would have no problem filling the prescription before leaving the car to catch a bus home. Bronwyn Kamak was also the person who suggested heroin overdose as a means of suicide when Anu had told her plans. It was also Bronwyn Kamak who Anu would call for help when she got cold feet as Joe lay dying. Anu called Kamak asking her to come around and revive Joe. Kamak refused and told her to instead to call emergency services. Anu claimed she couldn't. She feared that if the paramedics arrived, they'd use the drug Narcan, which reverses the effects of heroin overdose almost instantly. As she was worried, Joe would then know she had drugged him. Kamak told her in no uncertain terms that either she called emergency services or she would be facing a murder charge. She called Anu a selfish bitch, then hung up, essentially wiping her hands of the situation. Kamak then called an ex-boyfriend in Queensland. Court documents allege that calls between Anu and Bronwyn lasted 14 minutes. Kamak claims to have had no further contact with Anu Singh after that call, though she would call Madhavi Rao on the 27th where she outlined the call from Anu. They decided to meet in the city at 2 p.m. For the next 2 hours, Madhavi would tell Kamak the full story, how Anu had tried to kill Joe twice, and the drug she administered to him. As they were leaving their meeting place, Bronwyn asked Madhavi for money. She scored from someone nearby and shut up. They then walked to a nearby park and parted company. Though, they would meet later again that night, for when Bronwyn Kamak got home, she saw the news story of Joe's death. They met up at a bar and spent an hour and a half together, where Madhavi told her of her worries of being implicated. Madhavi also said she felt sorry for Anu. She wouldn't have a life after this. Kamak thought she deserved every bit of what she was about to get. After talking to Bronwyn Kamak, Anu did call emergency services, though the actual recording, as it was recorded, has not been made available to the public. I also won't quote the entire transcript here, as there is at least 5 pages worth. But at 12:10, a call was placed to emergency services. The first thing she says is she needs an ambulance because someone has potentially overdosed. The dispatcher then asks no less than 11 times what the address is. Anu either completely ignores the question or provides the wrong number on Anthill Street. The dispatcher then asks her name 4 times. On the 4th time she lies and says her name is Olivia. He again asks for confirmation at which point she repeats the lie and once again claims her name is Olivia. The dispatcher then walks her through the steps of resuscitation, which she struggles to do. She is then told to go outside and meet the ambulance officers so they can start CPR. When the ambulance officers arrive outside, they saw her standing on the nature strip, waving. They ran up the stairs and saw Joe lying naked diagonally across the bed. They noticed his stomach was full of air from a CPR attempt. His mouth and the sheets around him were covered in thick, dark vomit. They moved him from the bed to the floor so they could start working on reviving him, at which point they asked Anu how much he had taken. She replied 50 and some Rohypnol. They instructed her to massage his heart, but she didn't do it hard enough. They then tried to intubate him, but there was so much thick vomit in his mouth and down his throat, they couldn't insert the tube past it. They saw that everywhere near him was also covered in the thick, dark, viscous muck. They attempted to intubate him again. This time they felt they were successful, but couldn't be sure because of the amount of vomit that just kept coming. They tried for 5 minutes to revive him, but on seeing that he hadn't taken a breath that whole time, they stopped. Anu then started screaming that this wasn't meant to happen like this. They were meant to die together. The ambulance officers then attempted to cover Joe's body with a sheet, but Anu jumped on top of him and started to kiss and shake him. The ambulance officers dragged her from the room, one blocking the door with his body. She then began pacing from room to room and rambling to herself. At this point, the paramedics called the police. Anu was told she wasn't allowed to go anywhere, on inquiring if she was allowed to go out to buy cigarettes. They asked if there was a suicide note. She said no. It was something that had been planned for months in advance, and that he'd consumed the drugs at about 3 a.m. the previous morning. The fire brigade then arrived. On entering, Anu grabbed one of the woman's arms tightly and claimed, "He had a lot last night. He had a lot this morning. He was going to tell his parents." One uniformed policewoman and 3 male detectives entered the room. When asked what happened, she muttered, quote, "The original plan was I was going to do it. We were supposed to go together. I gave him 4 Rohypnol. I had had some. Then I had some heroin. I just kept pumping it into him to put him to sleep so he wouldn't be awake when I killed myself," unquote. She was then read her rights and arrested. She tried escaping from the police car. She had to be handcuffed. They then took her to the police station. Here they identified her as Anu Singh, not Olivia. She was then charged with murder. On the 29th of October 1997, Madhavi Rao was arrested at her house. She too was charged with the murder of Joe Cinque. Following her arrest at the murder scene on Anthill Street, Anu Singh was taken back to the police station and formally interviewed. She was accompanied by 3 men in the interview room, which consisted of her solicitor and 2 detectives. The interview would be recorded in its entirety, though the footage would never be made public in its entirety. During the interview, Anu fiddles with her hair, hands and clothing, of which is stained by the same dark, viscous liquid that covered the crime scene and made it almost impossible for the paramedics to intubate Joe. While the police are talking and asking her questions, she paces the room, from one side to the other, sits down and repeats the process. Her solicitor and 2 other detectives speak amongst themselves, while completely ignoring the pacing Anu. The 3 men are discussing her mental health and trying to ascertain whether she was a suicide risk. Madhavi Rao would be subject to similar questioning in the exact same room Anu had been pacing only 2 days earlier, both charged with the same crime. Much like Anu's interview, it would be video recorded in its entirety, but not released to the public. Also like Anu, there would be 3 men present during the interview, which included Madhavi's solicitor and 2 detectives. On the tape, Madhavi was sitting motionless at the table, listening intently to what was being said to her. She wore an oversized cream-coloured jumper, her hair cut to earlobe length. Helen Garner would say this on her appearance, quote, "At first glance, she could be mistaken for a 10-year-old boy," unquote. The detectives then informed Madhavi she was now formally charged with murder, at which point she threw her hands up and let out a gasp. She then asked them to repeat what they'd said in disbelief. When told for the second time that she was being formally charged with murder, she interjected and claimed to have, quote, tried to intercede at every stage, unquote. Following being formally charged for murder, Singh would be remanded in custody at Belkanen Remand Centre in the Australian Capital Territory. Madhavi was released on $100,000 bail, which her father had filled by using the family house as surety. After spending only a month in Belkanen Remand Centre, Madhavi's bail conditions stated that Madhavi was to stay with her family in Sydney. While in Belkanen Remand Centre, letters which Anu had written to family and friends were confiscated from her locker. Contained within the letters were basically more self-pity, almost alluding to the fact she was the real victim and how her life was going to be destroyed. Here is a little bit of what was written in those letters. Quote, I watched him die. I didn't save him. Then I thought, fuck, I don't want to die. The prosecution has a very strong case against me. I could be looking at 20 years. What a mess I've made out of a potentially perfect life. How much I wish this didn't happen so my life would be normal now. Married to Joe, a couple of kids, luxury, the works. I had the perfect life. Attractive, money, law career, everything. Now nothing because of my utter stupidity. I could have had the most wonderful man in the world. Now everyone else is better off than me. When I had it all, I bet everyone is laughing at me now. People would have envied me before. Now no one would want to be in my shoes, unquote. Belkanen Remand Centre allowed males and females to interact with each other. It was noted that in the 18 months that Singh spent in the remand centre, she had taken part in 3 romantic trysts, but only one was of any substance. Belkanen Remand Centre would also be where she met her current boyfriend, Aaron Baker. They would take recreation and eat lunch together, and would pass love notes to each other with the help of the guards. More on Aaron Baker later though. Regarding the trials, Singh and Madhavi would originally be tried together in October and November, but that trial was aborted when Justice Ken Crispin believed one of the vital pieces of evidence was problematic, as it was unclear which one of the pair the evidence referred to. Following the aborted trial, Singh and Madhavi Rao would be tried separately. Both would opt for a magistrate-only trial, meaning there would be no jury, as was the defendant's rights at the time in the Australian Capital Territory. I won't give a detailed account for either trial here, firstly because I have incorporated what was found during the trials into the bulk of the episode, and secondly because it is mostly just expert testimony. Anu would be represented by the solicitor Jack Pappas. Experts in psychology would be brought in to defend the fact that Anu was acting under diminished responsibility because of her mental ailments. They also claimed she suffered from a borderline personality disorder. The prosecution would need to rely solely on reports, interviews, and other miscellaneous evidence that was gathered by the experts for the defense, and during her time in the remand centre. Anu didn't make herself available for interview for the prosecution, again, as was her right in the Australian Capital Territory. Anu Singh would ultimately be found not guilty of murder due to diminished responsibility. She, however, would be found guilty of manslaughter. The fact she told multiple people of her plans, which she spent months perfecting, the fact she organised 2 dinner parties, tried to buy a gun, successfully obtained both Rohypnol and heroin on different occasions, who tried everything in her power not to call an ambulance, didn't seem to matter. Justice Ken Crispin would sentence her to 10 years for manslaughter, with a non-parole period of 4 years. She of course only served the minimum, of which only 18 months was spent in actual prison, for her time in the remand centre was taken into account. Madhavi's solicitor, Lex Lasry, would argue a technical case. She would ultimately be found not guilty of any charges and would be freed to leave, and live her life. Her case was also presided over by the same judge as Anu's, Ken Crispin. The fact she helped in every aspect other than injecting the heroin into Joe's arm didn't seem to matter. Following her minimum term in prison, Anu was released in October 2001 on parole. She would complete her doctorate and release her thesis called Offending Women in 2016. It is still available to be downloaded as an ebook for $35. I would have read and commented on the publication, but morally, I have a problem with giving even a cent to someone who murders in cold blood the way she did. I also don't want to give her the ego boost of speaking about her work in detail. On her Facebook, she flaunts her vegetarianism and shares quotes about mental health. She would do a few TV interviews and talk to the media a few times. In one interview, she wanted to apologize to the Cinques. They wanted nothing to do with her. Unfortunately, Nino Cinque would pass away in 2017. She now lives in Sydney with her boyfriend Aaron Erbaker. Oddly enough, while researching for this episode, I came across something rather interesting. On an Australian website known as goodreads.com.au, a place that is most well known for being a website for people to rate and comment on books they've read, I came across a profile which had only rated one book and had left no comments. The book that was rated was Joe Cinque's Consolation by Helen Garner. The person that rated it? None other than Aaron Erbaker. The rating was left on April 8, 2016. So much for moving on with your lives. Aaron would also speak to the media in 2017, claiming that she wasn't the evil monster she was made out to be. He also brought up the fact that people close to him would ask if he was worried he might too wake up with a syringe in his arm. His response was, quote, "Well, if I wake up with a needle hanging out of my arm, I wake up. And if I don't wake up, well, I don't wake up," unquote. Wow, obviously a very bright individual. Following Madhavi Rao's release, she basically faded into obscurity. A few pictures of her exist at the time of the trial, and I've heard she may have relocated abroad under a new name. Those claims are unproven. Leonard Mancini, the man who wasn't too interested in listening to Tanya Z's concerns, is now a solicitor, working mainly in commercial law. Just a tip, if you're going to try and scrub part of one of your employees' schooling, make sure to remove the metadata as well. I was able to find nearly all of the players in this case, those of which knew of Anu's plans. Some now have children, others sing in bands, and Joe Cinque is dead. In Maria Cinque's words, "This is bullshit." Thanks for listening.